Glistening Eyes. It is narrated that one night there was a great mystical audition function at the house of Mo'inuddin, where a large number of learned persons and holy men were gathered, and Maulana was in mystical rapture and cried out repeatedly in ecstasy. After a while he went into a corner of the hall and stood there, and said after a moment that the reciters should stop a while. All the sages who were present wondered at the request. Meanwhile, Maulana had plunged himself into a deep concentration, and then lifting his head, his two eyes ablaze with excitement looking like orbs of glistening blood, he said, "Come, friends, behold in my eyes the grandeur of the light of God." Almost none dared to look at them, and whoever attempted it, his eyes dimmed and his sight became lacking immediately. The disciples raised a cry of mystical bliss. Then Maulana looked at Chalabi Hisamuddin and said to him, "Come, my object of troth and confidence. Come forward, my most beloved, king of mine, the real king of mine, come forward to me." Chalabi shrieked with excitement at the praise conferred upon him, and tears ran down his cheeks. Maybe someone reporting the matter to Emir Tajuddin objected whether the great and distinguished qualities spoken about Hisamuddin were really meant, or was Maulana merely being polite to him. While this was being discussed, Hisamuddin Chalabi arrived at the scene. He caught hold of the informant and, addressing himself to Mo'inuddin, said, "Although previously the terms used by Maulana did not really apply to me, but as soon as he, the Maulana, spoke those words, they became a part of me, and the Holy Quran has it, Surah Yasin. His command, when he intends anything, is only to say to it, 'Be,' so it is." The work of the words of Maulana, though they cannot be likened to God's words, yet metaphorically are immediate and do not depend upon or require any explaining. The verse has it, "It is held that always copper is transmuted into gold by the philosopher's stone, but this philosopher's stone has made copper itself into the philosopher's stone." It is, therefore, not beyond the grace of Maulana towards his friends and disciples that thus these qualities might arise in the texture of his disciples. Those who had doubted his wisdom after this explanation hung their heads in shame, and after having been convinced of the truth, thanked Maulana. One other confounding attribute of Maulana was that no one could meet his stare, for the luminosity of his eyes was so great that whomsoever met his gaze, his eyes were compelled to be cast down. It is narrated also that the head of the teachers of the seminary, one named Maulana Shamsuddin Multi, may Allah bless his soul, who was one of the important disciples, reported that he was in the garden of the sage Hisamuddin with others with Maulana, who, having immersed his feet in the flowing stream, was given esoteric discourses to those assembled. Especially he was extolling the great mystical powers of Maulana Shamsi Tabrizi. One of the teachers of the seminary, known as Badruddin Walid, having been impressed by what Maulana was saying about Maulana Shams Tabrizi, heaved a sigh and said, "Woe to me, woe to me." Maulana, hearing that, asked, "Why these sighs and signs of sadness, and what occasion was there to express such sentiments?" The man replied that he was grieved by the fact that he had not had the good fortune to have met Maulana of Tabriz, and so did not gain further light from this illustrious torch of mysticism. Maulana became silent for a time upon hearing the explanation, and then said, "Although you have not had an approach to Maulana Tabrizi, you have arrived at the gateway of one in whose every hair 100,000 Tabrizis are attached, and yet wonder at Tabrizi's wafting of mighty waves of occult influences." He recited, Shamsuddin, who captured our heart's kingdom, in him our life is immersed. Everyone present was delighted with the allusion to the great sage, who was not present, and yet was so much thought of, and then he read a few verses from his poem. Suddenly my lips uttered the name of the rose and the rose garden. Then he came, and placed his hand upon my mouth, and said, I am the king. I am the soul of the garden. O illustrious one, if you like to be unto like to me, then ever remember me. It is said that for a full 40 days Badruddin was indisposed due to this meeting, and after seeking forgiveness recovered from his illness, and became very attached to Maulana. Books and the inner meaning within books. In a like manner, Sheikh Mahmud related that once Qazi Maulana Izzuddin, who was a minister of Sultan Kai Khusro, built a mosque in Konya and associated it with the name of Maulana. And being a man of great gifts and virtue, he asked Maulana one day, Whatever learning you have acquired, we too have studied those very books. But what you have received from those, and express it, is so much beyond us, and what could that mean? Maulana replied, Yes, it is true, but we have absorbed something from 1 or 2 pages from the book of learning of Allah, which have so far reached you, and it is from the grace of God. He vouchsafes it to whosoever he desires. The verse has it, Wisdom that the Zohal star, Saturn, gives does not match our penetration, and Utarid, Mercury, and Zohal put together may also impart knowledge to man. But God has graced us with a quality of spirit, and our beings are knit with the knowledge of hope. Thus the learning of divine wisdom, our only course and hope. Thereupon the celebrated Qadi, overwhelmed, burst into tears. The Mystic Dance. It is also narrated that Qadi Izzuddin was against the dance and music which induce mystical feelings in man. One day, Maulana, greatly moved by spiritual ecstasy, came out of the ceremony at the high moment of mystical music. He approached the Qadi and shouted to him, and asked him to come to the gathering where God was being praised, and pushed him forward, brought him to the meeting of those who love the Lord, as was befitting his state of nonconformity to the mystical experience. Forthwith he tore his garments in a fit of ecstasy, and like others plunged into mystical song, and danced around and shouted in excitement, and ultimately became one of the best disciples of Maulana. The Path. Likewise, it is narrated that the Qadi of Konya, one Izzuddin, the Qadi of Amasya, and the Qadi of Siwas, who were all men of great piety and learning, one day inquired from Maulana as to what was his path, and Maulana replied, This is my path, and enlightenment will come to the follower, meaning that his method of mystical practices was the path for others to pursue, and the followers would be enlightened by his guidance. This really emphasizing the fact that Sufi cult has no textbooks, and it is the murshid, or spiritual guide, who leads his disciples to the occult destination. All these 3 personages became his disciples. The Parrot and the Bald Man. Further, it is reported that when the Qadi of Adana had a mosque built and associated the building with the name of Maulana, the Qadi asked Maulana to give an address after the opening prayer at the new mosque, for the opening ceremony of which he had distributed a lot of money as largesse. Maulana delivered a sermon in which he spoke of a bird which was bald, and thereby deduced an object lesson for the people from the story metaphorically. At the conclusion, the great Saint Kamaluddin praised Maulana for the skill of the narrative, given as it was with such delicacy and inoffensiveness that its sting was not perceived by those men who were bald in the congregation, for both the Qadis were bald, and they were presiding at the gathering, and neither felt the slightest stigma. A quarrel. In a like manner, it is narrated that one day Maulana, when walking in a street, heard two men engaged in fierce altercation, hurling vituperations at each other. Maulana heard one of them say to the other, "If you use one foul word to me, I will reply with 1,000 in return." Maulana came forward and said to them, "Come, my friend, hurl your wrath upon me, for if you cast 1,000 vituperations at me, you will not hear a single one from me." The two were thus put to shame, and became friends through this wise advice. The Grammarian and the Well. It is further narrated that Maulana Shamsuddin Multi, may Allah bless his soul, related that once a learned man came to Maulana with his students, ostensibly to pay their salutations to the great divine, but also inwardly hoping to test the knowledge of Maulana and ask some questions. The students, of course, had always thought that all that is to be known of learning was in the bosom of their own teacher, and wanted to test the depth of Maulana's attainments. The visitors were with courtesy received by Maulana, who had guessed their motives, and he gave a discourse on diverse subjects, and then, as was his wont to make a point, he started to relate a metaphorical story about two young theologians, one a grammarian, and the one only a follower of a mystical path, though versed in the usual knowledge of religion. Both of them went for a walk, and during the conversation the one who did not attach too much importance to mere words pronounced a word with a slightly unusual inflection. The grammarian objected, saying that he, being in possession of greater knowledge, hence rather proud of his knowledge acquired from books alone, could not allow the word to be used in that way. They argued for a long time, neither noticing a dry well, and the grammarian fell in. He asked the other man to rescue him. The man said that he would pull him out only if he dropped his objection, but the grammarian would not yield and insisted upon his superior knowledge. The other man just left the grammarian where he was and went on his way. Relating this metaphorical tale, Maulana turned emphatically on the subject of self-pride and praise, and said, "Unless one shuns this insistence upon self-loftiness, one will always remain in the well of darkness, a darkness seen by others and not by him. An uncontrolled ego is like unto the dark well of that grammarian, and an unnecessary sense of self-importance is the outcome of that feeling." Hearing and appreciating this tale of mystic meaning, all of the visitors were highly impressed and became disciples. The Dervish and the Camel. It is also narrated that one day those assembled in the presence of Maulana were singing the praise of the governor of the country, one Muinuddin, by saying that during his governorship everyone was in physical comfort and well-being, and that his generosity was great. Maulana replied that that was the fact and 100-fold true, but that there was another aspect also to life, meaning that merely physical leadership was not enough, and a spiritual leadership had also its honored place, and related a story. Once a group of pilgrims were traveling towards Mecca on a pilgrimage, when the camel of a dervish who was in the caravan with them fell ill, and whatever they did to him, the camel would not rise to his feet. Apparently, the dervish was only receiving a courtesy ride and had no luggage of his own, so that the others, removing the load from the back of the sick camel, distributed it to other camels and left the dervish alone without a mount. Maulana emphasized the need of taking the dervish with the caravan and recited the verses, "Take thou a guide with thee, for without one this path is perilous. I have named the guide a star of good fortune, for guide he is not through age, but because of his mystical knowledge." The donkey. It is also narrated that one day Maulana was giving a discourse in the seminary and relating the inner meaning of many mysteries, when he asked whether the audience of students and his disciples understood why it is said in the Holy Quran, "Of all cries the braying of a donkey is the worst." Maulana said, "Most animals and creatures, when they utter sounds, pray and sing the praises of God, such as the camel, the she-camel, the humming of the bees, the sound that a wasp might make, but the donkey brays for no such purpose. He lifts his voice on only 2 occasions, when he is hungry and when he has a desire for mating. Likewise is a man," said Maulana, "in whose heart the love of the Lord finds no place. He is in fact a lesser being than a donkey." And he recited the verse thus, "Those whose passions are like the donkey's are less than it. If thou knowest not the path, then do the reverse of that which the donkey wants." Later, he related a story about a king who asked another ruler to send him the worst kind of food, the worst type of man, and the lowest animal. The king's royal friend sent him some bad food, an Armenian slave, and a donkey. In his letter, he quoted the Quranic verse, saying that the worst sound is the braying of a donkey. It is also related that one day Maulana and his friends were going towards the garden of Chalibi Hisamuddin. Maulana had as his mount a donkey. About his mount, he observed that he was following the saintly practice of riding on a donkey, because several prophets rode on donkeys, such as Seth, Ezra, and Jesus. Verse: "Ride on the bare back of a donkey, O thou the wise, for on the bare backs of donkeys rode the messengers of God." At that time the saintly Shahabuddin was also riding on a donkey, and it began to bray. Angered by the sound, Shahabuddin started beating his mount on the head, whereupon Maulana admonished him, saying, "Do not beat it, but thank God that you are riding, and that the animal is not riding you." Shahabuddin was ashamed, and as a recompense dismounted and kissed the hooves of the donkey. Further, Maulana observed, "As many men are actuated by the same emotions, equitably it would be necessary to beat up most men."